Welcome to today's sermon, where we're exploring the heart of giving, faith, and how we navigate life's most challenging conversations. Pastor Travis shares a heartfelt reflection on balancing faith and vulnerability in a world filled with extremes. Whether it's standing with joy or feeling uncertain, we're invited to see how God shows up in all the messy, broken places. Join us as we unpack what it means to give with love, confront systems that fail, and lean on a trustworthy God who never leaves us.
So there's a common joke that circulates around that pastors only work 1 hour a week, and presumably that hour is here with you in worship. And I'm sure there really are some people that think that, but I also know that there are a good number of people who know that's far from the truth. Ask any church worker, not just pastors, and they'll tell you a different story. Ask Jerry or Ruth how many hours of practice they put in a week for a single service or for a choir rehearsal. Ask the choir how much time they rehearse a week. I guarantee you it isn't an hour. We all take our job seriously. I'm not someone who comes to the task of being a pastor or a church leader or especially a preacher lightly. I spend a lot of time thinking about what the Bible readings we hear on Sunday mornings were like in their original context and how we hear them again today in the middle of all that's going on. And I confess to you that sometimes that makes preaching really hard. Today is one of those weeks. When I met with my therapist this week, as I do every Thursday morning, I try to put into words what I was feeling. And she pushes for that each week, and she'll push when I don't use feeling words. I told her that I really hated my job this week, especially as a preacher. As a preacher, my call is to deliver a message that I believe to be from God to you all who show up expecting to hear a message from God. And when big things happen in our world, like coming off the heels of a presidential election, you expect to hear something about that maybe, or how God is active around that perhaps. And you should expect to hear something about that, even a casual nod toward it. There are some preachers who would say that the message of the gospel hasn't changed, so just preach the gospel. And I will. I promise we'll get to widows and money in just a minute, and hopefully by the end of the service I'll have more than just my family in the congregation because we're dealing with politics, religion, and money. And you know, most of the time those things don't mix. And yet, if I just preach the gospel without touching on the election, well, that's why you don't see many of my generation in church, because we don't talk about the hard things and faith. But you see, the problem in our world today seems to be that we're all in extremes. I know some people in our congregation and our community who are really happy and pleased at the results of the election this past Tuesday. But I also know many people in our congregation and our community who are disappointed, hurting, and fearful. Somehow I stand in the middle, knowing that what I say and how we act together can really split this congregation. And trust me when I say, we don't need that. So, what do you say when you know all of this and you have to stand in the middle? That middle, which doesn't even feel like there's a spot for me to sit personally with my feelings that I don't even think I've experienced yet. I think we have to be honest with ourselves, friends. There really isn't a lot of middle ground that I've seen this week. And so, can we just be really gentle with each other today? Maybe we can recognize the deep feelings that are inside of us that we all feel. Maybe we can know that it's okay to feel those feelings, and it's okay to disagree with each other, and it's also okay to be in the same room while we do that. We're human. We aren't perfect. At some point, we're all going to disappoint each other. At some point, I, as your pastor, will disappoint you, and if that's today for you, then I'm incredibly sorry. But friends, humanity has been disappointing one another for a very long time. This isn't anything new. Go back to Cain and Abel. Go back to starting over after Noah and the ark. Look at where Jesus and the disciples are in the temple today. Jesus is taking on the scribes who sometimes seem to walk around in their great robes and who say long prayers and love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and the synagogues and get the best seats at the brunch table. Those ones, Jesus seems to say, devour widows' houses. Now, it would be silly for us to assume that all of the scribes are that way. Some of the scribes are city clerks. Some are very learned intellectual professionals. and some are really experts in the interpretation of Jewish law. But Mark is clear that Jesus here does have in mind those scribes who behave dishonorably. After teaching this, Jesus walks over and sits down at the place that has the best vantage point at the temple. He's sitting opposite the temple treasury where people come to pay their temple taxes. I imagine Jesus sitting with a coffee or a popsicle with the rest of the disciples, just looking at what's going on. He sees rich people putting in large sums of money into the treasury, and then he focuses his gaze on this widow. When it's her turn, she comes up and puts in 2 coins worth a penny, or really 7/10 of 1% of a denarius, or a day's wage for an unskilled laborer. It's something extremely minuscule, but it's also as generous as it can be considering her financial situation. This is all she has left, Jesus tells the disciples. She's put in more than all these other people because she's put in all that she had. Maybe you're wondering, so we're in stewardship season, and this is the point where I'm going to tell you that you should be like this widow and give all that you have too, right? I could say that, but I'm not. When we talk about giving, I don't want us to give out of guilt or fear or shame, but out of love and respect for God and for others. I'm not so sure that Jesus' words are complimentary of the widow. I mean, they are, and she really is being faithful. But she's being faithful at the expense of a system that's failed her. She's a widow whose husband has died and whose son maybe is dead, or she never had a son, or her family's unable to take care of her. And so the task then falls to the scribes and the religious leaders. God sets it up from the beginning that the widows and the orphans, or as we might say in today's language, the vulnerable, should always be cared for, always. And so we can assume here that Jesus is really angry about that, and certainly to the show-offy scribes who are a part of that system. She gives what she has in order to support God's temple and church, and to support the people whose faith are supported by it. And if that's the case, then she is acting out of her love of God and neighbor, even when she's not treated with the same dignity and respect. If that's what we're doing as a church, and we're expecting things to just continue the system without looking at the efficacy of that same system, then maybe we don't need to exist. I personally don't think that's what we're doing here as a congregation here at Peace. Is there room for us to grow in helping others? Absolutely. Would Southwest Michigan be worse off if we no longer existed? I honestly think it would be. I think our congregation would be missed, as would several other congregations in the same position. When we give, I hope that we give like the widow who gives out of love for God and for her neighbor. We give out of response to what God first gives us: love, mercy, grace, forgiveness, and even justice. I'm drawn to Brian Stevenson, who says the absence of poverty is justice. Poverty is more than just a lack of wealth. It's a social condition of being disfavored. And there are a number of people in our society who really understand that reality. As a person with a disability, sometimes I understand that to be true, even though I also understand at the same time I still operate my life out of immense privilege as a white male. Some systems in our world can be broken and disappointing. But Jesus still showed up to and for the temple system of his time that he knew to be broken. Jesus showed up for the religious political system that he knew was broken too. And just like this widow, Jesus gives all that he has, his whole life, for a system and a people who will ultimately kill him. But that's what God does. God still shows up. God still loves and cares and forgives and frees and dies for everyone, even systems and political affiliations and alliances that might be broken. God's promise has always been that God is with us and for us in everything and will never forsake or abandon us. That's the good news that's true now, that's been and will continue to be true forever. It was true before the election, it's true after the election, and it will be true way into the future. Because Jesus is raised to new life in the resurrection to show us that nothing, not fear, not hate, not even death, can separate us from our God and love and life with God. Regardless of where we sit today or how we feel, I hope that we will remember that and know that our God is trustworthy and will forever change the world just as God has always promised. So be gentle to yourself and each other today and in the coming days. God is always with us, but also remember that we need to care for each other as well. That's how we show as Christians that we look to Jesus to be our guide. Amen.
That's this week's episode of Peace Lutheran Sermons podcast. Don't forget to join us next week for another episode. Thank you for listening.